Today, we are discussing the role of opposition political parties in Africa. Many political observers describe the role of the opposition in Africa as an indispensable component of democracy. But for much of the continent, the opposition's role has not been enviable. My colleague, Esther Githui-Ewart, has our report.
For decades, opposition leaders and their supporters in Africa have been in constant confrontation and enduring running battles with ruling parties and incumbent governments, until he was succeeded by Emmerson Mnangagwa in November 2017. Robert Mugabe was the only leader Zimbabwe had known since independence from Britain in 1980. 4 decades after independence, Mugabe was accused of using death squads and rigging elections while crushing the opposition led by the late Morgan Tsvangirai. But after Mugabe's ouster through a de facto military coup, his former deputy turned rival and current president Emmerson Mnangagwa continues to stonewall the opposition through the strong arm tactics of its security forces. Ahead of the budget speech on November 22nd, Zimbabwe's police and parliament security ejected opposition legislators from parliament after they refused to stand up in honor of President Mnangagwa as he entered parliament. In Cameroon, where violence connected to a separatist movement in the nation's Anglophone region has forced tens of thousands to flee, 85-year-old President Paul Biya won re-election to a 7th term in a landslide victory in October. But his victory came amid claims from opposition candidates that the election was marred by fraud, ballot stuffing, and voter intimidation. In what appears to be the norm after elections in parts of Africa, opposition leader Maurice Kamto claimed victory at a news conference in Yaoundé and called on Biya to hand over power peacefully, but did not offer any evidence to support his win. In 2017, longtime Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga went to the Supreme Court to seek the nullification of President Uhuru Kenyatta's election victory. A Kenyan court granted his request, but Odinga, however, pulled out of the repeat election and later declared himself the people's president at a ceremony in Nairobi. Protests and chaos erupted in various parts of the country, and the government, using police and other security personnel, engaged the protesters in violent street battles, using tear gas, wounding, and even shooting anyone who stood in their way. In South Africa, besieged former President Jacob Zuma faced a no-confidence vote in Parliament, with the opposition describing him as a broken and corrupt leader. And as lawmakers prepared to vote in a secret ballot to oust him from office after years of scandals, opposition firebrand Julius Malema of the Economic Freedom Fighters took to the floor to address Parliament. A minute later, his mic was switched off. But his supporters continued to protest on the streets, demanding Zuma's ouster. Eventually, Zuma stepped down. While visiting Ethiopia last month, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Tibor Nagy appealed to ruling parties in Africa to consider opposition parties as competitors rather than enemies. Nagy praised the example being set by Ethiopian Premier Abiy Ahmed as a model for other African countries. In Uganda, opposition leader Kizza Besigye, a former personal physician to President Yoweri Museveni, has endured years of police brutality. The government has often employed security officials to either keep him under house arrest or physically abuse him. Here, Besigye, whose hand is in a sling, is seen kicking police officers who are shoving him into a vehicle.
With hammers!
And he's not done yet.
What sort of police is this? Working with hammers.
As the Democratic Republic of Congo heads to the polls on December 23rd to replace another longtime president, Joseph Kabila, there are many opposition candidates running against Kabila's appointed successor and presidential candidate, Ramazan Shadary. Some 21 candidates are vying for the top seat. Several of the opposition candidates say they will support Martin Fayulu, others Felix Tshisekedi, while some in the opposition say they will support Shadary. Many of the rest say they would rather go at it alone. raising the question, are they really in opposition to the ruling party? Esther Githui-Ewart, VOA News, Washington.